Something I was thinking about the other day that I hadn't actually considered for quite a while was how much in the first half of my life I enjoyed the activity of running. And I did it quite a bit for exercise, but also just for fun, sometimes as a way to get around, sometimes as part of my job duties, like when I was in the Army. And I kind of took it for granted until the point where I couldn't do that anymore. And, that happened definitively in my early 40s when I had this terrible accident out at Montauk, and two of my ligaments in my left knee were torn, the ACL and the MCL. Never did get them replaced, and, the doctor basically said, well, any running days that you had are long over. And at that time, I was in so much pain, and there was so much rehab involved with that I didn't worry about it. But even in, my late 20s, in part because of, how my bones had shifted, my ankles were pronate, and issues with that, when I would run for exercise, I would find I would get extraordinarily sore in different muscles, so I just didn't do it. I biked at that time and took long walks, oftentimes with a big backpack filled with weights, but I wasn't a runner. But in the early years of my life, basically from being a little kid onward, it was just part of how we would get around and what you did in, for example, gym class, and it was tied in with so many other activities. And so I thought I would, do a Sadler Stories telling you about some of the periods of my life and ways in which I got involved in running. And I'll add this as well, that my dad was not a runner, but he died by the time that I was about to turn 12. And my mom, I think if I remember right, by then had already started to take up running. And she wound up having a boyfriend later on, several years later after my dad died, who also was a big runner and also a big biker. He was very into exercise. You may have heard me talk about him in another video. His name was Francis, and he became sort of a surrogate dad to me and my sister. Anyway, coming back to things. So from, childhood onward, I remember engaging in a lot of games and, things on the playground and during gym class where everybody would run. And some people were better at it and some people were worse at it, but it was just taken for granted that you were going to run. And unless you had some sort of really outstanding physical issue, you weren't getting out of it either. And a lot of the games, there was tag on the playground. You'd run around, chase each other. We'd pretend sometimes also to be doing Battlestar Galactica or Star Wars battles, and we'd pretend that we were fighters and chase each other around and make pew-pew noises at each other. And then there was, games like Fish and Whales or Red Rover. And after you got done with school, there was also, in one part of the year, I played for the Wales Dragons, soccer. And actually, when I went to middle school, soccer was taken very, very seriously. And everybody had to be on the team. So you did a lot of running with that, especially if you were a halfback. And so it was just part of a physical development. And we also, because of where we lived, and I've talked about this in other videos as well that I'll post to below, we had this massive semi-natural, partly humanized playground of hundreds and hundreds of acres of woods and hills and meadows and marshes. And, in order to get around, we would sometimes walk and sometimes we'd ride our bikes. But a lot of times we would just kind of jog from place to place because it was a quicker way of getting around, and it was kind of fun, that feeling of freedom that comes with crossing territory quickly, eating up the yards or miles, and going through these cool trails all over the place. So that's something that we did as kids a lot in my neighborhood as it was slowly filling in. And we'd range sometimes for quite a long way. And of course you'd get sweaty and you'd get winded, and sometimes you get like a stitch in your side, but you just went on. It was not that big of a deal. So we were all pretty skinny and ravenously eating and in pretty good shape physically as kids, me and a lot of the other kids that I knew. And we would also play games that involved a lot of running. Like we would, get together and we'd play basketball or soccer or football or baseball. And every one of them involved some sort of sprinting, at least, right? Back and forth and chasing people. And then when we would get together for various club things like Cub Scouts, or sometimes it'd just be like neighborhood stuff, we'd all play these games that would involve running around. Like I mentioned tag, but we had Ghost in the Graveyard or Sardines. These are kids' games that you play in the Midwest and perhaps other places that often involve like going around a yard and a house, and then when you see the ghost in the graveyard who's going to try to tag you, everybody has to run to try to get to the safe place, the ghoul. So running was incredibly tied in with our life. And then, when I got to middle school, I mentioned, we all had to play soccer, and we did other, for gym class, we did other things in the other seasons. We would play in the winter, we'd play indoor soccer. We also tended to play flag football, which of course involved running. In the spring, there would be baseball, and I'm trying to think of what else we did. So, and you'd always warm up. The coach would be like, go run some laps, and then everyone would run until, it was time to start. So we just kind of took it for granted as that's what people do. And when I was at University Lake School for middle school, they had an enormous campus. And at lunchtime, lunch and something like recess were combined together. So they would, you'd eat in a cafeteria, and then you'd basically be on your own to do whatever the hell you wanted, so long as you showed up at class later on. And I would actually, sometimes with another guy who is also interested in doing this, I would run the trails. I would actually put my gym clothes on after eating and go run. And it was you get to know some of the trails. Sometimes you'd be surprised, but it was fun. It was being out in nature, and then it was kind of nice just to see the sights and smell the fresh mowed hay or things like that. And so that was a significant part of my time there. And then when I got to high school, I should have actually gone out for cross country, because I did enjoy running in the woods and doing these longer things, right? But we were in such chaos in my family. I also should have tried out for soccer, because I was really into that. But things were such a mess after my dad died that just wasn't on our horizon, So I didn't get in on that, but in gym class, I ran. We started out with a track and field unit, and I turned out I had a talent for running. And so our coach, who was also my gym teacher, Chuck Bova, you may have heard me talk about him at other places, he was like, you should go out for track. And I was already doing, in the fall and the winter, fencing, which I loved, because, handling swords, and I got to start doing saber and hanging out with what I consider to be the cool kids, the burnouts, and we had a lot of fun. And then spring was for track. So I loved track, and I also hated track. And I didn't like, here's what I didn't like about track. Eventually I got pigeonholed in doing the what's really the worst race that you can do in competitive track and field, which is the 400 meter, and then of course you'd have to also do, because we had a small team, the mile relay, where you've got 4 people doing the 400 meter. So the 400 meter is 1 lap around a track. And the reason why I say it's no fun and it sucks is because you start out at a sprint, and you can't really sprint for 400 meters effectively unless you're a super person, right? And so you run and you take off, and everybody's running together in this big horde, and then you get around the bend and you start getting a little bit tired and winded, and your muscles start to hurt. And by the time that you are at the roughly 3/4 mark, lactic acid is built up in your body for at least, 10 to 15 seconds. They call it the bear because it feels like somebody is scratching down your back through the muscles. Everything's burning. You can't get enough air, but you can't stop running, right? Even though you're not sprinting anymore, you're power striding and actually just trying to get the damn race over with. And everybody else is in the same boat. And if you're doing the mile relay, you've also got this baton in your hand that you're running with, and you're going to either hand it off to somebody or you're the last person in the link, and then you better do a good job on that. So I wasn't so happy with that. I did get to run the 200 every once in a while. What I really wanted to run was the 800 because I was a good distance runner. But our coach, once he decided what you were going to do, and he decided it basically on body type, he was like, "You're a 400 runner." And I was like, well, okay, that's that. And I would also run around my neighborhood, and me and my buddies would get together and we'd run, and it was, part of exercise. And of course in gym class, which we had really throughout all of high school, you would start out most days by running some laps just to warm up. So again, I kind of took it for granted. Did my first 10-mile run on a 100-degree day with a friend of mine around Waukesha, just to figure out that I could actually do it. And then, I continued running as a form of exercise while I was studying martial arts and working as a grill cook until I went into the Army. And then, of course, in the Army, you run a lot. It's one of the main forms of exercise. You also walk a lot, march a lot, especially in basic training. But you would just, it was quite common that we would get up in the morning, show up in formation at 6:30 for PT, and then, sometimes it would be calisthenics, sometimes it would be other sorts of exercise, but a lot of times they'd just be like, all right, we're doing another 5-mile run, and we'd get together as a platoon, and we would run basically in formation. And I'll tell you something that's kind of funny about this. I mentioned this in my video when I talked about smoking. So us younger guys, in the Army, a lot of people back then in the 1980s and 1990s smoked cigarettes. And part of it was because it was so cheap. There weren't any state taxes, so you could buy a carton of cigarettes for $7. So we would usually have, as we were running in formation, if somebody remembered to bring it, a pack of cigarettes and a lighter in that pack of cigarettes. And the older guys would frown on this, but we younger guys would be like, we'd almost do like a relay. You'd be running along, fast pace, take some puffs on the cigarette and then hand it up to the next guy in front of you, and then he'd take it and puff on it. Or if he wasn't a smoker, he'd hand it to the next guy, and the cigarette would go, like halfway through the platoon before it was consumed, and then somebody would light up the next cigarette. So we'd be running and smoking at the same time, and we could get away with that because we were in such great shape. Looking back at it, it's kind of ridiculous. But, we also would sometimes just go out for runs for fun in the Army. We also did these Volksmarches because I was stationed in southern Germany and in Bavaria or Bayern. And Volksmarches were kind of a big deal. And so, those would usually be like through the woods, and there'd be places where you could stop for beer and stuff. And since we were kind of hardcore, sometimes we'd run in our actual uniforms with combat boots and a backpack, and you'd run through the woods with all your buddies. Sometimes we just put on some running gear and decent running shoes and run the course, and then finish up and have some beers. And so that was the Army. And then I got out and started working as a cook again, and continuing exercise, and running was a key part of that. Then I went to college, and I went to college up in this place called Lakeland. At that time, college, now Lakeland University. Officially, it's in Sheboygan, but it's actually like about 10 miles outside of Sheboygan. It's not even in the village that it's viewed as being closer to Howard's Grove. It's like basically in the middle of cornfields and stuff. And there was a guy who I was studying in my calculus class with. He was a local guy, and he liked running, and I liked running. He's like, why don't we start running together? So we do that. And he was a little bit older, and he wasn't quite as fast, but he could keep up, and we'd run on these little roads around, and that was a lot of fun to do that together. And sometimes I'd go running at night as well, which could be a little dicey because sometimes dogs would, chase you or stuff like that. But it was something that you feel a certain vitality as you're doing it. That's something I do miss about being able to run like that, even though I can still go for long walks, and I can do other things where you got that feeling of movement. Can't really run anymore unless I absolutely have to, and that's just for a short pace, and then I feel it in my knee afterwards. So I continued running through college. I helped train the soccer team, and of course played some indoor soccer as well. That was a lot of fun. That involved running. But Lakeland also had this massive woods and marsh that went all the way to this river behind the college. It's all walled off now. You can't get back there. But I could go back there and run for miles on these trails. Some of them were like well marked. Some of them were basically just deer trails. And I'll tell you about something that happened that was really quite cool. I mean, I would go there and I'd run down to the river and watch the carp rolling as they're mating, seeing the coppery scales, or see other kinds of wildlife, and it was really quite wonderful. But I was running one time, and I'm going fast, right? And I've actually got like a stick in my hands, because there were some wild dogs that you'd have to worry about. And I come into a clearing, and at the same time, running the opposite direction, comes a stag. And we are about maybe 6 feet away from each other, just looking at each other. Both of us stop, and I can hear him snorting, and he's got like a full rack of antlers, and he's big, but at that time, I'm super athletic and kind of charged up on my running, and I got this stick in my hands, and I don't know what the hell I thought I was going to do. Like, somehow I'd go after the deer or something like that. And so we're like standing there looking at each other, and he stamps his paw, and then he turns around and bolts the opposite direction. And I'm all charged up on adrenaline, and I chase after him. And he loses me within, like a minute or so, because he knows the woods way better. And he's got 4 legs, I've got 2, and he is moving fast. I don't know what the hell I would have done if I would have caught up to that guy, but it was something pretty extraordinary. Then another really cool thing around that time that happened, I graduated from college, and I was living in this little village that was just down the road from Lakeland called Franklin, with Wild Bill and his 130-pound German Shepherd, Lobo, who was a great dog, loved the guy, and Lobo really liked me. And Bill went away. He worked for like the Park Service or something. He had to go away for like a month for trips. And so I was just working at this gas station, convenience store, second shift, and, reading and working out and stuff like that. And I decided I'd start taking Lobo on runs. And so we did that on these county roads. We would get together and maybe run over by Lakeland or, run other places. And it was a beautiful time of year. It was like July and August. All these wonderful flowers were in bloom. There were places we'd go where there were beehives. You could see the bees whizzing past you from the field to their hives across the road. And man, did Lobo love that. And so we had a great time together. And then I moved down to Milwaukee. And, now once I was down in Milwaukee, I didn't really run so much anymore. Instead, I was working two jobs. One is as a barista in a cafe. The other is a third shift security guard. And I kept doing taking walks with the backpack full of weights, about 70 pounds in there for conditioning. And I would listen to tapes for learning languages at the time in my Walkman. So I wasn't doing a lot of running then, and I think it just sort of started to fall on the wayside for me. After that year, I went to Europe for about 5-6 weeks, to Quebec as well, but I was traveling around as a tourist with a big backpack, came back to here, went immediately down to Southern Illinois where I started graduate school. And around that time, I was about 25 or so. So we're talking about, first half of my current life. And then, I lived on campus the first year. And so I'd do a lot of walking, not a lot of running at that point anymore. Weightlifting, doing other kinds of exercise. And then I moved into a trailer park that was either south or north of campus, maybe north of campus on 51. And it was about 1.5 miles, I think, to campus, to the edge of it. And I would walk a lot, and then I got myself a bike, and I would just ride. So I wasn't running for exercise. I wasn't needing to, and I would do it if I had to, but it dropped out of my what would you call it? My repertoire of exercises, because back then I was actually working out 2 to 3 hours a day. And at a certain point, because my legs are a bit messed up, I think, the musculature and the skeleton and, my ankles, it wasn't painful to run for short distances, but it became painful afterwards to run, for exercise. And so I was like, well, I guess I'll just do other stuff instead. And now it's decades later, where that kind of locomotive exercise, going somewhere on your feet with what we used to call your leather personnel carriers, your LPCs back in the Army. It's all done with walking for me. And that's good enough. But I think back to those days, the younger me, and the delight and vitality and enjoyment that was there for me, even as I'd get tired, even as it would be hot, or you get sweaty, or you're stressing your body out. I really did enjoy it. And so I thought I would, I was thinking about that the other day, and I thought I might share some of that story with you. Could be of interest to some. And I would encourage everybody, as I wrap this up, you don't have to run, but everybody should be doing some exercise, because you don't want to, I can say this from experience, you don't want to let yourself get out of shape physically. And it's good also for your mind to be exercising physically routinely. So that's all that I have to say about my years and years and years of enjoying running.